They called it a terrible mistake. After the divorce, alone and pregnant, she spent her last savings on an abandoned gangster mansion no one else would touch. The place was falling apart. The past was dangerous. But what she discovered inside that abandoned gangster mansion wasn't decay or crime. It was a truth buried for decades, one that would shatter everything she thought she knew and completely change her future. Before we begin, subscribe for more powerful stories and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Helen Marchand hadn't been called brave in a long time. Not when her husband walked out with a 23-year-old barista, not when the bank repossessed their house, and certainly not when, at 39 and 4 months pregnant, she used the last of her divorce settlement to buy a house everyone else thought was cursed. But standing at the rusted gates of Lennox Estate, Helen felt something that had nothing to do with logic, a pull. The mansion was an overgrown beast on the outskirts of upstate New York, once owned by a Prohibition-era gangster named Angelo Red Lennox. Rumors swirled about bodies in the walls, hidden vaults, and money that was never found for decades. No one dared touch it. Helen did. She found the listing on a government auction site. Bought it sight unseen? Everyone told her it was madness. But when the past has already burned down behind you, walking into a haunted mansion feels strangely peaceful. As she gripped the heavy key and stepped through the rotting front doors, dust swirling in the cold air, Helen whispered to her unborn daughter, "This place has secrets. And so do we." She didn't come for ghosts. But the house had been waiting for her. The first night was colder than Helen expected. The old radiators moaned but didn't heat. She lit a fire in the living room hearth with a bundle of old newspaper and pine logs she'd picked up in town. It popped and crackled with more drama than warmth. But it was something. She sat cross-legged on a dusty rug, a mug of tea cradled between her hands and her belly rising beneath a thick sweater. The air smelled of mildew, old wood, and maybe bourbon. She couldn't tell if it was her imagination or some lingering ghost of parties long past. That's when she heard it. A faint thump, somewhere upstairs. She froze. Not a house-settling creak, not the wind. A dull, deliberate sound like something heavy being dropped, then dragged. She stood slowly, her heart thudding in rhythm with her baby's movements. Probably a raccoon, she muttered to herself. Maybe a possum, or a ghost with bad knees. She climbed the grand staircase, the steps groaning underfoot. The flashlight on her phone barely cut through the thick dark, but she followed the sound to the east wing, where faded wallpaper curled from the walls like ancient scrolls. The door at the end of the hall was cracked open. She pushed it slowly. Inside was a bedroom, untouched by time. Dust coated the vanity. A velvet armchair sagged near the fireplace. But what caught her eye was the wardrobe. One of its doors was ajar, and inside, a sheet had been pulled down as if someone had just searched through it. Her breath caught. "No one else is here," she whispered. But her voice didn't sound convinced. She checked the room, opened the windows, then the closet. Nothing. No animals. No squatters. She left the door open on her way out. Back downstairs. She double-checked the locks. She sat awake until the fire turned to embers. The next day, Helen explored the house more fully. She moved room by room, clearing cobwebs, opening shutters, letting light flood in where it hadn't touched in decades. The mansion was bigger than she'd realized. 3 floors, an attic, a full basement, and a greenhouse in ruins. It was beautiful in the way forgotten things are achingly silent, stubbornly standing. She found an old radio, a dusty mirror etched with initials A-O-L, and a photo behind a dresser of a man in a pinstripe suit with a cigarette dangling from his mouth. On the back, someone had written Red 1932 before it all fell apart. That night, she returned to the East Wing bedroom, determined to face it head on. Nothing moved. Nothing thumped. But when she stepped back into the hallway, she noticed something odd. There was a faint outline on the wall just beside the wardrobe room, a rectangular seam, barely visible, like a door someone tried to hide with paint and wallpaper. Helen pressed her palm against it. It was solid, but she felt a tiny draft. Her heart raced. She rushed to the kitchen and returned with a knife, peeling away the paper along the seam. Beneath it, she found aged wood and a rusted keyhole. "Where's the key?" she muttered. She didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Something in her gut told her that door whatever was behind it was part of the reason she was here. 2 days later, while clearing out the study, she found it. The key! Tucked inside a hollowed-out book titled The Blue Dahlia, resting on a high shelf. It was old, brass, and ornate, shaped like a rose. She didn't hesitate. Back in the East Wing, she slid the key into the lock. It resisted, then clicked. The door swung open with a long, aching groan. Behind it was a narrow staircase, steep and spiraling down into darkness. She hesitated at the threshold. The air was cooler here, denser. She reached for her phone, turning on the flashlight again. Step by step, she descended. At the bottom, she found a room that hadn't been touched since the 1930s. Wood-paneled walls, an old poker table, empty whiskey bottles, a bar, and on the far side, a safe. Not a modern one. A monstrous, iron beast bolted into the wall, its dial worn from decades of use. Next to it, a small filing cabinet, toppled over. Papers spilled across the floor. She knelt carefully, gathering them. Blueprints, ledgers, names, codes, maps. And at the top, a file labeled Marchand Confidential. Helen's blood ran cold. Her name, in a gangster's house, and just like that. She realized she hadn't just bought a forgotten mansion. She'd bought her way into a history she never knew she belonged to. The folder labeled Marchand. Confidential trembled in Helen's hands. She sank into the cracked leather armchair beside the dusty poker table. The silence in the secret room pressing in on her like fog. She opened the folder. Inside were yellowed papers, fragile from age, birth records, photographs, letters typed on brittle stationery. The first page stopped her cold. Subject Margaret Marchand, alias Margaret Lennox. Helen blinked. Her grandmother's name was Margaret Marchand, but her family had always told her she was a French immigrant, quiet and reserved, who'd worked as a seamstress and died before Helen was born. This report said otherwise. Margaret Lennox, listed as the wife of Angelo Red Lennox, the very gangster who'd owned this house. Helen's heart pounded louder with every word. According to the file, Margaret had disappeared from FBI records in 1943, presumed dead after a federal raid on one of Red's warehouses. No body was ever recovered. But the final page was a photograph, grainy and faded. A woman holding a baby. She wore a pearl necklace and a fear in her eyes that reached straight through time. Helen stared. It was her grandmother. And the baby. The birth date matched her father's. The next morning, Helen drove into town. It was a small place, one diner, one general store, one suspicious postmaster who looked like he'd been alive since the Civil War. She took the photo to the local historical society. "Excuse me," she asked the older woman at the front desk. "I just moved into the Lennox place. I found this. I think it's from the 1940s. The woman, whose name tag read Irene, adjusted her glasses and peered at the image. Her mouth twitched. "Well, I'll be damned," Irene whispered. "That's Margaret Lennox. She disappeared after the feds raided the docks. No one ever found her." She tapped the photo. "That baby. Folks said she was pregnant when she vanished. No one ever saw the child." Helen tried to steady her voice. "Do you know if she had any living relatives?" "Not that we know of. The Lennox name died with Red. Or so we thought." Irene narrowed her eyes. "You said you just moved into the estate." "Yes," Helen replied carefully. "I bought it in a foreclosure auction." Irene looked at her more closely now. "You bear a resemblance. You know, around the eyes." Helen drove back to the mansion in silence, her hands shaking on the wheel. The baby kicked gently, as if sensing her turmoil. She wasn't just connected to the house. She was descended from it. From them. Her grandmother hadn't been a quiet French seamstress. She had been married to one of the most dangerous men in the state, and she'd gone into hiding, changed her name, and tried to raise a child in peace. Helen's entire family history was a lie. And then, the phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Miss Marchand. A smooth, male voice spoke. "You've uncovered something that was never meant to see the light of day." Helen froze. "Who is this?" "You don't need to know my name. Just know this. Walk away from that house. Forget the files. Forget the safe. Before this becomes dangerous." "Is that a threat?" she asked, trying to keep her voice from cracking. "It's a courtesy," the voice replied. "Next time, we won't call first." The line went dead. That night, Helen didn't sleep. She sat by the fireplace, the folder in her lap, the phone clutched in one hand, a fire poker in the other. Someone knew. And if they knew, it meant what she found was real, valuable, dangerous. She reread the reports in the file. Red Lennox hadn't just been a gangster. He had amassed a hidden fortune, millions in today's value, smuggled out of New York during the Prohibition crackdown and hidden away. The safe in the basement wasn't just for poker chips and whiskey. It was a vault, and she had the key to its location maps, codes, ledgers all in her hands. In the early hours of morning, headlights cut through the thick fog outside, a black SUV parked just beyond the gate. Helen's heart jumped. She turned off all lights, crouched behind the curtains. Two men stepped out of the vehicle, suited. Tall, stiff in their movements. They didn't knock. They circled the property, slowly. One tested the side door. Locked. They waited outside for 10 minutes, then left. But not before sliding a white envelope under the gate. Helen waited until sunrise, then walked out barefoot to retrieve it. Inside was a note. Typed, clean, precise. "Leave now. This house does not belong to you." And beneath it, a photo of her, standing in the hidden room, holding the folder. Taken through the window. Helen stepped back, chest tight, mind racing. She wasn't safe. Not yet. But she couldn't leave either. Because what she held wasn't just money or secrets. It was truth, it was family, and it was her unborn daughter's legacy. They wanted her out, afraid of what she'd reveal. But they had no idea who they were dealing with, because Helen Marchand had nothing left to lose. And that made her more dangerous than any gangster ghost in the walls. The next morning, Helen stood barefoot in the kitchen, staring out the window at the long gravel driveway. The black SUV was gone, but its shadow lingered. She hadn't slept. Her mind played the conversation on the phone over and over again. "You've uncovered something that was never meant to see the light of day." But it was too late. The light had already found it. She looked down at her belly. Her daughter shifted gently inside her. "You're going to know where you come from," Helen whispered. She made a decision. No more hiding. No more fear. She wasn't just going to protect what she found. She was going to understand it. All of it. She started in the study. Every file, every photo, every scribbled note in the margins of Red Lennox's ledgers. She read through his coded journals, now half deciphered with the help of the notes she'd found. The man wasn't just a bootlegger. He'd been meticulous, paranoid, brilliant. He'd laundered millions through shell companies, hidden cash in the walls, gold bars beneath floorboards, and even fake identities for his family in case everything went wrong. Which, apparently, it did. But one line stood out, written hastily in the back of one of the smaller ledgers. If anything happens to me, Margaret knows where it ends. The river sees all. Helen felt her breath catch. Margaret, her grandmother. She hadn't just run. She'd carried the truth with her, possibly even a piece of whatever Red was trying to hide. And if that truth hadn't died with her, then maybe it had been passed down to Helen. Later that afternoon, Helen drove to the edge of town, where the Mill River wound through a stretch of forest. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, just that she had to look. She parked near an old stone bridge, got out, and started walking along the riverbank. At first, nothing stood out. But then, about a mile in, she saw something carved into an old oak tree, a rose, nearly identical to the design etched on the key she'd found inside the Blue Dahlia book. She followed the bend of the river and found a pile of stones, carefully arranged in a formation that looked too precise to be nature. Her pulse quickened. She knelt, brushed away the leaves and dirt, and found a metal hatch, sealed shut. Her hands trembled as she fit the rose-shaped key into the lock. It turned. The hatch opened with a hiss of trapped air. Inside was a narrow staircase descending into cold, damp darkness. She didn't hesitate. What she found wasn't gold, not yet. It was a room underground, dry, lined with metal shelves. On them file boxes, dozens of them, stamped with the same insignia: Lennox Industries, private holdings, ledgers, land deeds, photos of men shaking hands in smoky rooms, confidential deals, political bribes, evidence, blackmail, everything. And in the back, a large trunk. She opened it to find cash wrapped in oilcloth, stacks of bearer bonds, gold coins, and tucked inside a smaller velvet box, a pearl necklace. She knew that necklace. She'd seen it in the photo of her grandmother. Helen's fingers hovered over it, then closed the lid. This wasn't just a treasure trove. It was leverage. That night, back at the mansion, Helen sat in the parlor, the pearl necklace in her hands, the fire crackling in front of her. She understood now. This house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by truth, by what powerful men tried to bury, by what strong women had protected. And all this time, she thought she was running from her past, her ex-husband, the failure of her marriage, the loneliness. But she'd actually been running toward something, toward who she really was. She thought she was just a woman who'd been left behind. But she was a descendant of survivors, of fighters. And now, she wasn't just a mother-to-be. She was the keeper of a legacy. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. She stood slowly. This time, she didn't feel fear. She opened it to find an older man in a gray wool coat, his hat low over sharp eyes. "You must be Helen," he said. She nodded. "I was a friend of your grandfather's," he continued. "Or maybe just an enemy who respected him." She didn't say anything. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. He held it out. Red said one day, "Someone would come back here with the guts to finish what he started. Looks like it's you?" Helen took the notebook. Inside were names, locations, passwords, more keys, more secrets. The man tipped his hat and walked back to his car. He didn't ask for anything, didn't explain why he came. He just knew. And now Helen did too. She wasn't here by accident. She wasn't just rebuilding her life. She was reclaiming her bloodline. And the real story was just beginning. The morning after the stranger left the leather-bound notebook, Helen sat at the kitchen table in the soft gray light of dawn. The mansion, for the first time, didn't feel like a weight pressing on her chest. It felt alive, like it was breathing again after being asleep for decades. The notebook was open in front of her, dozens of names, locations, dates. Some were politicians, others were business tycoons, many long dead. But a few were still very much alive. And some of them, Helen recognized from headlines. At the very end, scribbled in careful block letters, was a single sentence, "Don't let them erase us." That morning, Helen understood something she hadn't before. This wasn't just about secrets, inheritance, or even bloodlines. This was about truth, and what you choose to do with it. By noon, she'd driven into town and parked in front of Milton and Finch, the only law firm listed in the county phone book that didn't have a last name that appeared in Red Lennox's ledgers. She met with Gillian Finch, a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Helen laid everything on the table, figuratively and literally. The ledgers, the deeds, the cash, the names, even the black and white photograph of her grandmother with baby in arms. Gillian listened in silence, then leaned back and exhaled slowly. "Well," she said, "you've got enough here to bring down half the state if you want to." "I don't want revenge," Helen said. "I want to protect what's mine, and maybe do some good." Gillian raised an eyebrow. "You sound like your grandfather." "I sound like my grandmother," Helen corrected. "She's the one who started over, who tried to break the cycle." Gillian nodded once. "Then let's build something new." Over the next few weeks, Helen got to work, with Gillian's help. She established a private trust, legally securing the Lennox estate and the assets found in the underground vault. She used shell companies just like Red once had, but not for crime or concealment. She used them to protect her legacy from the people who would try to take it. The first thing she funded was repairs. Local contractors were hired, not big corporate crews, but single moms with drywall businesses, veterans who could barely get work, young carpenters fresh out of trade school. The mansion began to change room by room. Windows replaced, roof repaired, garden restored. The rot pulled out piece by piece, just like she was doing with her own life. One night, sitting on the restored porch swing, belly now heavy with her daughter's weight, Helen watched the sun melt into the horizon and felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about preservation anymore. It was about purpose. A week later, she filed the paperwork for a non-profit organization, the Margaret Foundation. Mission: to provide housing, resources, and community for women in transition, divorced, displaced, or in crisis. Because Helen knew what it meant to have nowhere to go. She knew what it felt like to be pregnant and alone in the world, and now that she had a house with 13 empty bedrooms, she saw no reason they should stay empty. The East Wing was repurposed, first fresh paint, new beds, working bathrooms. She partnered with local shelters and social workers. The first resident arrived within 2 weeks, then a second, then a mother with 2 children. They didn't ask about the mansion's past, and Helen didn't bring it up. All they needed to know was this: you are safe here. You are not alone. And you have a future. One morning, as she made tea in the kitchen, a young woman named Rachel, 6 months pregnant and fresh out of a toxic marriage, stood in the doorway. "You own this place?" Rachel asked, disbelief in her voice. Helen smiled. "It owns me just as much." Rachel looked around at the high ceilings, The polished wood floors, the golden morning light streaming through lace curtains. It doesn't feel like a shelter. It's not, Helen said, it's a home. For all of us. That night, Helen sat in the hidden study beneath the house, the journals and files carefully stored in locked cabinets. She added a new file of her own photos of the renovations, names of the women who now lived there, letters of gratitude. She slipped a note in front of it. This is how we break the cycle. Not with threats, with sanctuary. She looked down at her belly and smiled. You're going to be born in a house full of strong women, just like the ones who came before you. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, but inside the mansion, there was warmth, laughter down the hall, smells of dinner in the air. The ghosts hadn't left. They were just watching. And finally, they were proud. Helen Marchand stood in front of the mirror in what used to be the grand dining room of the Lennox estate. The chandelier above her head, once layered in cobwebs and stained with decades of smoke, now sparkled with new life. Her reflection was different now, too. Not because she wore makeup, not because her hair was brushed or her clothes were clean, but because, for the first time in years, she recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes weren't tired anymore. They were focused. Her shoulders weren't hunched with shame or fear. They were strong, grounded. She wasn't the broken wife who had signed her name on divorce papers. She wasn't the woman who cried in a Motel 6 bathtub while holding a sonogram photo. She was something entirely different now. She was founder of a sanctuary. She was protector of a legacy, and very soon, she would be a mother. By the third month of the house's transformation, the community started noticing. The townsfolk who once whispered behind her back at the grocery store now brought casseroles and blankets for the women staying in the house. The general contractor left extra insulation free of charge. A local teacher offered to run free classes in the old library. One afternoon, a woman in her 60s knocked on the door, holding a faded photograph. Her voice trembled when she spoke. This was my mother. She worked here in the 40s, housemaid to Red Lennox. Said he was rough, but his wife Margaret, she was kind. Said the house was always full of secrets, but also full of life. Helen took the photo with reverence. The house was beginning to speak again through memories, through people, through healing. And so was she. But growth isn't always peaceful. It's painful, like stretching muscles you forgot you had. It's waking up at 3 with doubts pressing down on your chest. It's asking, am I strong enough? Am I doing the right thing? Helen wrestled with that every night. She read through more of Red's journals, torn between pride and discomfort. His world was brutal, ruthless. But beneath the blood and business was a man desperately trying to protect his family from the forces closing in. And now she was doing the same. Only instead of guns and bribes, she used paperwork, permits, and compassion. Instead of hiding money in vaults, she used it to fund prenatal care, education programs, and legal assistance. What Red had buried underground, Helen was lifting into the light. Then came the day the first woman left. Rachel, the one who had stood in the kitchen asking if the place was real, the one with the bruised heart and nervous hands. She had gotten a job, moved into a small apartment nearby, and came back with flowers for Helen. I never thought I could start again, Rachel said, her voice cracking. You gave me that. Helen didn't know what to say, so she hugged her. Tightly! Later that evening, Helen wrote in her own journal, a small leather one she kept beside her bed. They think I gave them something, but the truth is, they saved me just as much. Her contraction started 2 weeks earlier than expected. It was the middle of the night. Rain tapped on the windows, and thunder rolled somewhere deep in the hills. She tried not to panic. She texted Gillian Finch and one of the nurses volunteering at the shelter. Within minutes, the house came alive. Mrs. Patel, A retired midwife who'd taken a room downstairs was by her side in less than 5 minutes, calm as ever. "You're in good hands," she said, laying warm towels on the bed. "This house was built for storms." Helen gripped the edge of the mattress and laughed through the pain. "Everything about my life has been a storm." Mrs. Patel smiled gently. "Yes, but look at you. You didn't drown." After 8 hours of labor, just as the first light began to push through the curtains of the east wing, a cry filled the room. "Clear, strong, alive." They placed the baby in Helen's arms, wrapped in a quilt stitched from scraps donated by the women who had come through the house. She was small but perfect. Dark curls, her grandmother's nose, her great-grandmother's eyes. Helen stared at her and whispered, "Welcome home, Eleanor Margaret Marchand." That night, as the baby slept curled against her chest, Helen sat in the old rocker by the window and looked out at the grounds of the estate. The moonlight shimmered over the trees. The wind whispered through the walls. There were still rooms in the house she hadn't explored, still secrets left untouched. But that was okay, because now she knew who she was. Not the girl her ex-husband abandoned, not the woman who bought a broken house on a broken heart, but the mother, the heir, the builder of something that would outlive her. And the house, it no longer felt haunted. It felt holy. 6 months later, the Lennox estate didn't look like a haunted mansion anymore. The paint was fresh. The porch swing didn't creak anymore. It laughed with the giggles of toddlers learning to walk. The east wing glowed warmly each night, filled with women learning how to begin again. And in the west wing, the original family rooms, Helen sat in the rebuilt study, a journal open in her lap, her daughter asleep in a cradle beside her, swaddled in the same blanket Margaret Lennox had once hand-stitched during her own exile. Outside, the wind stirred the oaks. They no longer whispered secrets. Now, they told stories. Stories of women who refused to be erased. Helen looked around the study. Where ledgers once listed bootleg runs and bribes, now those shelves held photographs, framed moments of joy and resilience. Rachel, smiling beside a tiny apartment key. Dana, hugging her son after winning custody. A letter from a woman named April, who simply wrote, "You made me believe I deserved to come home again." Helen kept every letter. Because that was the part no one tells you. Legacy isn't found in blood or bank accounts. It's in what you do with the broken pieces. It's in what you choose to rebuild. The townspeople no longer looked at Helen with suspicion. Now they waved when she walked to the market, stopped her for advice, invited her to speak at town hall meetings. They even started calling the estate by a new name, the Marchand House. At first, Helen had corrected them. It was the Lennox estate, she said. But then one of the women, young, brave, and 7 months pregnant, smiled and said, "Now it's yours." And Helen realized something. She hadn't just inherited a house or even a mystery. She had inherited a mission. And more importantly, she had fulfilled it. One morning, Eleanor, 6 months old, with eyes full of fire and a laugh that bubbled like champagne, reached up and pulled Helen's journal from her lap. It fell open to the first page. Helen picked it up and smiled. It read, "Day 1. I don't know who I am anymore." She turned to the last page and added, "Day 184. I know exactly who I am now. I am my grandmother's courage. I am my daughter's future. I am the storm and the calm that follows it." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Helen walked out to the garden. Eleanor cradled against her chest in a sling. The stone path, once overrun with weeds, now bloomed with roses planted by the women themselves. Each flower bore a name. Not the names of the past, but the names of those who had survived, those who had stayed, those who had begun again. Helen paused by the final bed, still unplanted. She bent down, set Eleanor gently on the soft blanket nearby, and dug a small hole with her hands. Into it, she placed a brass key, the rose-shaped one, the one that had opened the first door to the past, the one that had started everything. She covered it with soil, pressed it down with her palm, and whispered, "Thank you. Not just to the house, not just to Red or Margaret or even her younger self, but to the journey, to the silence that had taught her strength, to the darkness that had made her seek light, to the solitude that had carved space for rebirth." She picked up Eleanor, kissed her soft forehead, and looked towards the horizon. "There will come a day," she whispered, "when you'll ask me what this place is, why it matters, what we're doing here." She smiled. "And I'll tell you, this is where women come to stop running. This is where broken becomes sacred. This is where silence turns into song." In the end, she didn't need a monument, didn't need applause, didn't need history books, because Helen Marchand had built something no one could bulldoze. A legacy not carved in stone, but rooted in love, reborn in healing, and alive in every breath her daughter would ever take. And that was everything. Sometimes, the greatest turning points in life begin in the ruins. Helen Marchand didn't set out to become anyone's savior, not her own, not her daughter's, not the women who would later fill the halls of that once-forgotten mansion. She simply wanted a place to start over. But in choosing to stay and choosing not to run from what scared her, she stepped into something bigger than herself. In a world that tells women to disappear quietly, Helen chose to stay. And in doing so, she lit the way for others to follow. If this story moved you, subscribe. More powerful stories are on the way. Know someone starting over? Share this with them. Sometimes, all it takes is one key to change everything.